Good afternoon, all. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today for Retain Ohio's March webinar. My name is Nicole Abramovich. I am a research coordinator for Retain Ohio in the Cincinnati region.
Hello, everyone. I am Dina Zidian. I'm the Referral and Enrollment Supervisor for Retain Ohio. And our special guest, go ahead, Joanna.
Hi, everyone. My name is Joanna Forbes, and I am a human resources consultant here in Youngstown, Ohio, in human resources, and a faculty member at Youngstown State University.
Thanks, guys. Just a few housekeeping items before we begin with today's topic. Our next webinar is set for June 3rd. Erica Ramsey, owner and marketing strategist with Leap Branding and PR, will be joining us to discuss increasing brand affinity while marketing to a moving target. So, as always, it is free to register, and I highly encourage you all to do so. At this time, I'd like to ask everyone to please use the chat stating your name, organization, and job title, just so that we know who's out in our audience. The slide deck for today's presentation will be attached to all registered in a follow-up email this afternoon. In that email will also be a link to our YouTube channel where you'll be able to find our webinars along with our podcasts and our future recordings. A short survey will be prompted following this presentation, and we do appreciate any feedback that you're able to provide for us to help us plan for our future presentations. And as always, we do welcome our audience to join the discussion today by using the chat for any comments or questions throughout the presentation, and there will be some time at the end for any remaining questions. So like they introduced themselves, I've got a referral and enrollment supervisor with Retain Ohio, Dina Zidian, and our guest speaker, Joanna Forbes. And before I do pass it over to Joanna, I'd like to invite Dina to come off the mic and just give a brief update on some of the great things that Retain Ohio has been up to.
I am sorry, Nicole, I am not seeing your screen. So at this time, we have 5,146 employees enrolled in the Ohio Retain program. That's 1,840 from Cincinnati, 1,410 from Toledo, and Youngstown leading the pack with 1,896. We also have 882 employers, and that is throughout all of Ohio. As you can see the numbers there for Cincinnati, Toledo, and Youngstown. We are happy to have all our new employers that have enrolled in February. If you receive our employer status summary, you get a better look at all the names that have enrolled recently. So we appreciate everyone participating in Retain Ohio. Thanks, Nicole.
Yeah, thank you, Dina. And now I'd like to go ahead and pass it over to Joanna if you'd like to go ahead and share your screen from here.
Sure. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Yes, I want to continue. Okay, Nicole, if you could just let me know if you can see my slides.
I can.
And are we flipping to the agenda?
We are.
All right, great. Okay, I will go ahead and get started. I'm excited to be here with everyone today. I saw some Youngstown folks pop up in the chat. So hello, neighbors, probably right outside my window. Today, we're going to be talking about the exciting world of family medical leave. This can be very confusing for a lot of business owners, HR folks like myself, and any managers in any organization. So I was excited to come here today and talk about this. So we're going to talk about what FMLA is, who it applies to, what organizations it applies to, the process, the timeline, what your employees' responsibilities are, benefits during that time, intermittent leave, which can be very difficult to manage, returning to work and what that looks like. And then we'll just touch on extended medical leave and military leave before we get to some questions. Okay, so first things first, what is FMLA? What is family medical leave? So family medical leave is 12 weeks of unpaid leave time off that protects an employee if they need to take time off. And we'll talk about those reasons here in a minute. Some confusion sometimes lies with, do we have to pay or do we not have to pay people who are off on medical leave? And the actual regulation is that it is unpaid, although many employers and many of you that are on the call today maybe do pay your employees when they offer on medical leave. So that is definitely up to the employer. But in terms of the law, it is an unpaid leave. This was designed during the Clinton administration around 1993 to help employees balance their work, their family responsibilities, and take time off for any sort of family and medical reason. A lot of times people will use FMLA interchangeably with maternity leave. While that is one reason why an employee may use FMLA, that's certainly not the only reason. So who does it apply to? So, and I did see some school folks pop up on the call today, but it does apply to all public agencies, all public and private schools, and companies that have 50 or more employees. The 50 or more employees is also needs to be in a 75-mile radius. I don't have that on here because that doesn't apply a lot. Most companies follow the 50 or more employees regardless of where their employees are. And what does this mean? If you have 50 or more employees, or you're one of those other employers that I mentioned, you must provide your eligible employees, and we'll talk about what that means, up to 12 weeks of unpaid leave each year for any of the following reasons. So what are some of those reasons? Some of the most common things we think of are the birth and the care of the newborn of a child, for placement of adoption or foster care, or to care for an immediate family member, somebody that you're the primary caregiver for. So a spouse, a child, or a parent with a serious health condition, or to take care of your own serious health condition. So which of my employees are eligible, or is it all of my employees? Not typically, unless you have all full-time employees or employees that works part-time regularly. So an employee is eligible for this leave, and I have it highlighted there, if they've worked at least 1,250 hours in the last 12 months. So, and what that normally means is that they're working consistently part-time. They're working consistently about 25-ish hours a week, usually is what gets you up to that 1,250 hours in the last 12 months. And just know for your payroll system, that does not include vacation, personal time, other sick leave, or holidays towards that 1,250 hours. So any employees, you have 50 employees, you are an eligible employer, you have employees that work at least 1,250 hours in the last 12 months, they are an eligible employee. So there's two things that you want to look at there to make sure you know who is eligible. So what is our responsibility as business leaders, as school leaders, as HR folks out there, or business owners? It is our responsibility to recognize the need. And as I have on there, employees may not always be aware of FMLA and what their rights are under this law. So it is our responsibility to make sure that we recognize it and that we inform our employees of their rights. We're not supposed to wait for them to always come to us because they may not quite understand it. This is difficult for some of us who've been doing it for 25 years to understand. So it's not always easy for employees either. So what should we be looking for? So it is important to recognize those needs, to listen to our employees. So some things that we should be listening for example, if an employee discloses to you that maybe they're the primary caregiver for their parent or their child, or that they need time off from time to time for doctor's appointments for an ongoing qualifying illness or injury. So I have that in bold because that is the language that's in the Family and Medical Leave Act. It has to be a qualifying illness or injury. And usually what that means is something chronic and something that's considered a serious health condition. Another very common example that we see in the workplace is an employee discloses to you that they have an upcoming surgery, that they need to be out for. And again, they may not know what FMLA is, and you would want to make note of that and have that conversation. So we're not all doctors, we're not all medical health professionals, so we may not be sure if the employee's personal illness or their family member's personal illness qualifies for FMLA. So if you do have an HR team, you would want to speak with them. You could always speak to an attorney or some sort of FMLA expert to make sure that you understand that it is a chronic or serious health condition. Typically, it's easy to recognize whether or not something is considered chronic or a serious health condition. So what do we do if an employee comes to us, they request a leave, or they disclose to you a reason that might qualify them for some sort of leave of absence? So you want to listen to your employee. What is the situation? What is happening? Is it their own injury or illness, or is it a family member's injury or illness that they will be the caregiver for? Take notes of what your employee is saying to you. Reach out to your HR team. If you are the HR team, again, you may need to reach out to somebody else if you can't make the decision on your own. And you just want to make sure that the leave does qualify for family and medical leave. And then you're going to distribute the proper paperwork, which we'll talk about exactly what that should look like here in a minute. And then just another thing is sometimes you'll have employees, it's like, oh, I don't want to go off on that. I don't want to use that. Well, employers do maintain the right to place an employee on FMLA when an employee discloses to you that they have an injury or illness that is covered under FMLA. So what are some questions you can ask your employee? So I do get this question a lot from businesses that I do HR consulting for, and also from my students here in the HR program at YSU. So what are we allowed to say? So do you need to take a medical leave of absence? Would you like me to provide you with the FMLA paperwork? If you notice that your employee is having a difficulty performing the essential functions of their job, is there a reason? Do you want to discuss an accommodation for something that you have going on that's impacting your ability to perform the essential functions of your job? I notice you're having absences. Was your recent absence due to a medical condition that's ongoing? Can you provide a doctor's note confirming that your recent absence was due to a medical condition? Can you provide a doctor's note confirming that you're able to return to work doing your regular duties, which is just as important for safety reasons for your employee? What you want to avoid, and I have there at the bottom, is asking any questions about their medical history, about their diagnosis, or about their treatment. So notice the questions are primarily geared around their work, what they can and what they cannot do, and making sure you understand whether or not they need FMLA. Communication is very important during FMLA. So you want to make sure that you have the expectations outlined. And when we talk about the paperwork, I'll talk about that again. But you want to make sure that there's communication between the employee and the employer. You have to have some sort of process to file the paperwork, to review the paperwork, and to maintain the paperwork. Some sort of checklist always works best. It does not have to be very complicated, but something that's going to work for you and the process. So you can make sure things come in time, what you received, what you didn't receive, how many times you left a voicemail with somebody, when they called you back. So it is important to have some sort of process so you're consistent in how you communicate with employees. In other words, are you calling one employee every day and another employee you haven't heard from in weeks? What is the process that you have? So you do want to make sure you have some sort of process, a checklist, something that you use as you go on. And communicate with your payroll department as well. Some of you on the call may be the payroll department. It's very important to make sure your payroll department or whoever processes your payroll, if you have an outside vendor like an ADP or something like that, that they know how to properly pay the employee. So what is this paperwork that I'm talking about? So you should have FMLA packets. So you should have consistent paperwork again. So when employee A comes to you, they're getting the same thing that employee B is coming, that employee C is coming. You want to be consistent in this process, just like anything that we do in human resources. So typically you're going to have what you see here on the screen. You're going to have some sort of initial leave of absence request form that you would want an employee to complete saying, hey, having surgery in 2 weeks, probably going to be off for 6 to 8 weeks. And that is what gets the ball rolling. That's what kind of triggers the whole process. If you have an employee come to you who's not familiar with FMLA, not familiar with FMA language, but they're talking to you about it, you're going to hand this one of them and say, hey, I need you to complete this so we can kind of start this process. Once they complete some sort of initial leave of absence request form, and that can look like whatever you want it to look like, whatever it works for you, you would want to give them a certification of healthcare provider form, which is on the Department of Labor website. And when Nicole sends out the slides, I can also put a link to this form. It's a PDF, comes right from the Department of Labor, and it says certification of healthcare provider at the top. You don't need to reinvent the wheel. You can use their form. And that's what the healthcare provider will complete, saying what the employee or the employee's loved one has that they need time off. Have standard letters of communication between yourself as the employer and the employee. And this standard letter of communication should outline the dates and what are the expectations, meaning when is everything due back in the office in terms of the paperwork? What is maybe the approximate day that the employee is going to come back to work? So some things in there that there's a consistent letter. You want to keep that, use that letter over and over again. Again, you want to show that you have a consistent process when it comes to dealing with different employees. And then, of course, you want to have some sort of internal tracking form or spreadsheet that tracks that your employees are out on a leave, whatever that looks like. This could be part of that checklist that I mentioned before. This could be something that's part of your HRIS system, your Human Resources Information System. This could be something that you do in Excel, your payroll, whatever it is. But you do want to have something that tracks the time that your employee is off. And I just wanted to stop here for a second because I didn't mention, because I'm talking generally, some of you on the call may have short-term disability. Some of you on the call may have a policy where people have to use all of their PTO or their paid time off when they're off. All of that should be in this letter that I'm talking about, in this standard letter of communication. Any policy that you have that talks about FMLA or your leaves of absence should be part of this communication. Okay, so what kind of timeline are we looking at here? The Family Medical Leave Act does have certain timeframes built into the regulations, and that's what I have up here on the screen right now. So my first thing I have over here on the left, my first box, it says an employee must notify employer within 3 business days following the first absence that may qualify for FMLA, or as soon as they know they will need it in the future. And what this is referring to is if you have an accident or an injury, that you should let the employer know within 3 days. Now, you and I may have all been in a situation where maybe an employee was incapacitated. They were unable to communicate. You didn't get a hold of somebody in the family until the 5th day. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're not eligible for FMLA in these extreme circumstances, but this is the general time frame that you should follow. And then once the employer receives that notice from the employee, their initial request for FMLA, or perhaps they call you and let you know they're going to be out, you as the employer should let that employee know within 5 business days if they're eligible or not from FMLA protection. 99% of the time, employers, we know right away whether or not somebody is eligible or not. We can usually tell if it's a serious injury, chronic or a chronic illness. And then the employer should send the employee all of that paperwork. So this would be an employee that's perhaps already home. Sometimes employees, if they know they're going out, they just kind of hop back over to your office to get it, but they should get that letter that I was talking about that outlines expectations. that initial FMLA application, and then that physician certification form that I talked about before from the Department of Labor. And that should be part of that packet that you're giving them. A lot of times, a good practice would just be to have that employee sign that initial request right away. Now you have that, and we can get this ball rolling with all of these timeframes. And then built in the regulation, employees then have 15 calendar days to submit all FMLA paperwork back to you. So it gives the employee about 2 weeks to get their ducks in a row, get all of their paperwork filled out. Again, we all know that we're also dealing with maybe the doctor's timeline. When the healthcare provider completes that paperwork, which might not be within those 15 days. So the key point is keeping the communication up. It is 15 days, but if you hear from an employee on day 13 that they have already called their physician's office 3 times and they're waiting to get this paperwork back, you don't want to just deny. You want to work with that employee. There are reasons why sometimes this time frame doesn't work, but generally that's what you should be following. Okay, so the employee, they have some responsibilities as well. They should be submitting all of their paperwork timely, as timely as they can. They should not be sitting on it. Typically, like I mentioned, that should be returned. Everything should be returned within 15 days of receiving it from you. The employee is also responsible for continually communicating if any circumstance changes that may impact their FMLA, such as maybe they were released to work sooner than they thought, or perhaps the opposite. Maybe they need to take time off longer than what they initially thought. So they need to continually communicate with you as well. So let's talk about health insurance during FMLA. Part of the regulations is that an employee is entitled to all of their group health insurance that they're on at their place of work and life insurance. So what happens during this time, and most of you on the call probably have an employer paid portion and an employee paid portion. The difficult part to manage could be if the employee is not getting paid. So they're off on FMLA, they're not using PTO, they're not using any sort of in-house short-term disability or vacation time or anything. So they're not receiving a paycheck. So again, in terms of consistent process. So if their employee is not paid or there's not enough income to cover their share of the health insurance, you want to make arrangements with that employee to make sure that their portion of the health insurance premium is paid. So you could either invoice them to receive a check for those payments. When they come back to work, you could do some catch-up pays working with the payroll, but you do want to have some sort of process in place to manage those missed portions of the health insurance. If they are getting paid, typically their portion will just continue to come out of their paycheck. Okay, let's talk about intermittent leave. So intermittent leave can be very difficult to manage. And it's, I hesitate to say more popular, but it is becoming more common. For one reason is because employees are more aware of the rights that they have under family medical leave. So we are starting to see more intermittent leave happening in the workplace than I think we ever have before. I've been in HR for over 20 years now. But intermittent leave is taken in separate blocks of time. So in other words, intermittently. So I don't need 6 to 8 weeks time off, but perhaps I need 1 day a week for the next 6 to 8 weeks for therapy. Or I need time off when my condition flares up, for example. So if an employee takes time off intermittently, or if they need any sort of reduced work schedule because of an injury or illness for themselves or for their loved one that they're taking care of, the employee should try and schedule this time so as to not really disrupt operations of the employer. That's always the best option. If you can have an employee let you know as soon as possible that they're going to be off for whatever this approved intermittent leave is. And I will mention to you that it's all of the same reasons that an employee may need off for regular FMLA. It's just they might not need those solid chunks of time. The other thing that employers can do, and that's the last bullet I have up there on the screen, is you can temporarily transfer an employee to a different position as long as it's being paid the same, benefits are the same, and of course, as long as they're qualified, if it better accommodates during this intermittent time. But it does not want to be something that looks like it's a retaliation against that employee. It just wants something that would work better for operations. So that's a conversation that you could also have with an employee. So just like how I mentioned, it's important to recognize regular FMLA, it's also important to recognize the need for intermittent. So again, it's the responsibility of the employer, the manager, the HR person, the business owner, whoever it is, to recognize that need. So some of the indicators that we see for intermittent FMLA, an employee mentions to you that they have a serious health condition, oh, I have to go for treatment every Thursday for the next 3 months, or they mention this to you. If you're starting to see a lot of repetitive doctor's appointments, medical appointments, hospital visits for the employee. If they're talking about needing to care for a family member that has a serious health condition, if they're starting to perhaps call off for that, or they're taking a lot of vacation time to care for somebody, that would be an alert for you that perhaps it's intermittent FMLA. If they start to mention that their caregiving duties are starting to interfere with their work, you would want to have that conversation with them. Any sort of observations that you might make. Now, again, we're not healthcare professionals, at least I'm not. Most of you on the call probably aren't a healthcare provider. So we're not in the business to diagnose, but if we do see some observable symptoms of any sort of medical condition, we can have that conversation with employees and remind them of their rights. Some things that your employees may ask of you if they need intermittent FMLA is, they may ask for some flexibility in their work, maybe perhaps remote work, if that's an option for your place of work. I know not all of us have that option. And of course, if they explicitly say to you, I need time off for medical reasons, then of course we know that falls under intermittent FMLA. Very important to track intermittent FMLA. And I will say that intermittent FMLA is the same amount of time as regular FMLA. So employees ever kind of reaching that 12-week part in a rolling 12 months is pretty difficult for intermittent FMLA, but you still need to track it. You still want to track it. So again, if your payroll system has that feature, if there's a code that you can put in for FMLA, or if you manually have to track it in some sort of Excel document, whatever works best for you. So, for example, if an employee has approved intermittent FMLA to care for their sick spouse, they must use FMLA during times they take off to care for the spouse. So it's not one of those things where I'm going to use it for Tuesday, but I'm not going to use it for next Thursday. FMLA is what it is. Once it's approved, once somebody has intermittent FMLA for a qualifying reason, anytime they're off for that qualifying reason, it needs to be tracked. On the flip side of that, if the same employee that has intermittent FMLA to care for a spouse needs a day off to care for their sick child that is not covered under current FMLA, say their kid, has the flu, or they're home for a few days, strep throat, something like that, that employee would not track that day off as FMLA. So intermittent FMLA doesn't cover an employee for anything that might pop up in terms of healthcare for themselves or for a loved one. It's the same process as regular FMLA. It has to be approved. It has to be for that one reason. Okay, a lot of words here on the screen, so I'm not going to read this to you, but I do get this question a lot, and it's about recertification. It's like, how often can I ask my employees for documentation? They gave it to me once and then I never saw it again. So how often can I ask employees for recertification? When I say recertification, I'm talking about that medical certification from a healthcare provider. So generally, it's a 30-day rule. It's a 30-day rule. So generally, as employers, we're not permitted to ask the employee to get recertified any more than every 30 days. Sometimes, though, it is more than 30 days. So if you look at that second one down, and again, you will be getting a copy of these slides, so none of us have to memorize all the things on the slide today. But if right off the bat, the medical certification says it's longer than 30 days, and I have an example on here say it said 90 days right off the bat, then we as the employer have to wait 90 days. So I just wanted to kind of put that in there. I get this question a lot. So it does have on here every 6 months. So if you have an employee on intermittent FMLA, a very simple rule of thumb is every 6 months to go ahead and ask that employee to get recertified by their healthcare provider or their loved one's healthcare provider. If it's less than 30 days, only if they're requesting any sort of extension of the leave of absence. So, okay. So again, a lot on this screen. 30-day rule is kind of the rule of thumb every 6 months for intermittent leave, and don't ask before the first one expires. You follow those rules, then you'll be pretty set and you'll be pretty compliant when it comes to recertification. Again, I get this question a lot, so I wanted to put some examples in here. So if we look at this one, Janie takes 6 weeks of FMLA for a cancer operation and treatment and gives her employer a medical certification that states she'll be absent for 6 weeks. Because her certification covers a 6-week absence, the employer cannot ask for recertification during that time. At the end of the 6 weeks, Janie asks to take 2 more weeks of FMLA. Her employer may ask her for a recertification for those additional 2 weeks. So that's an example for that. Another example I have on here, Joe takes 8 weeks for a back operation and therapy, and he gives that medical certification that says he'll be out for 8 weeks. At the end of the 8-week period, Joe tells his employer he will need to take 3 days of FMLA per month for an indefinite period of additional therapy. His employer may properly request a recertification at that time. 6 months later, and in connection with an absence for therapy, the employer may properly ask Joe for recertification. I put this one in here because in my experience, I've seen many intermittent FMLAs where the healthcare provider just says indefinitely, this person has this indefinitely. And that's when we start getting into, well, how long can I hold on to this certification? So 6 months is a great rule of thumb for that. Another question that I get is, well, can I call my employee's healthcare provider? For most of us, we're like, oh no, who wants to do that? And normally you wouldn't, right? Normally you wouldn't. Everybody on the call, I'm sure, is familiar with HIPAA. The regulations clarify that contact between an employer and an employee's healthcare provider must comply with HIPAA. So under those regulations, employers may contact an employee's healthcare provider, and I have that highlighted in blue, for authentication or clarification of the form. So in other words, and the example I have on here is, does this say 6 weeks or 8 weeks on page 4, right? So those are the types of things that we're looking for. Under no circumstance should a direct supervisor call or ask for anything beyond verifying the paperwork. So for those of us that work at small businesses, and maybe you're the HR, you're the payroll, and you're the manager, you're all of the things, you may be the only one that can call. But most of the time we do have another person that can call, and it really should be the HR professional. If you don't have those, I know a lot of small businesses don't, you can use an outside company to help you with FMLA. A lot of small businesses can't afford that as well. So you could use simply another management official at the organization. So it's time to return to work. So employees should notify you, whether you're the HR or you're the manager, as soon as they're aware of their return to work date. So they should make every attempt to put the employee in the same position the employee had before the leave, with equivalent position, equivalent pay, benefits, and all other employment terms. In other words, we cannot retaliate, or it will be seen as retaliation, against an employee for taking time off. They come back and then we put them in a different position, or maybe in an unfavorable shift or something like that. An employee should submit a fitness for duty certification from their doctor, their healthcare provider, before returning to work if the leave was for their own personal illness or injury. If the leave was for their loved ones, you do not need to see that, mom is back home on her own now. That you do not need to see that. So this is only if an employee is coming back from their own illness or injury. So typically, and I say typically, if an employee fails to return to work at the end of their 12-week period, the employee will typically be considered voluntarily resigned. The hope is that you have a conversation with your employee, so this isn't something that's a surprise for them or for you. Sometimes people just say, you know what, I'm out. When my leave time is up, I'm not going to come back. And that happens. It is considered a voluntary resignation, or the communication stops and you no longer hear from them. You should have a policy for that if that comes into play, if you stop hearing from an employee. And again, this should all be outlined in that letter that I'd mentioned before. It's very important to outline those expectations. So if you have an employee come back and they say, I'm back, but I can't do all of the things that I normally can do. So they may need some restrictions or some light duty. So you would want to just request that accommodation. Typically, and everybody here on the call is from somewhere different. So light duty or working with restrictions is called something different everywhere. And what that looks like everywhere is different. Obviously common light duty tasks are any sort of, computer training work, desk work that they can do, or anything that's relevant to your organization. The important thing to note, and this is something that I would recommend having in your leave of absence policies, is that light duty is not guaranteed. And they're reviewed on a case-by-case basis. I just wanted to mention, if any of you on the call have a collective bargaining agreement or a union at your place of work, you may have some of these things outlined in your CBA that are different or specific to your organization. So always follow your collective bargaining agreement if you do indeed have one. Okay, so as we're getting now towards the end of our path here, our extended medical leave. So the 12 weeks is up, and now what do? We don't want to lose our employee, but maybe they still need a couple weeks off for whatever it is that they needed time off for. So again, this should be a policy at your place of work. A very common example, and I have here on the screen, is that you allow employees, an additional 3 months, an additional 12 weeks. Some employees have longer. They have 6 months, up to 12 months. Again, this might be part of your CBA if you have one at your place of work. You would want this to be a policy because you want this to be consistent. That is the most important thing. If you give Bob 2 extra weeks after his 12 weeks are up, and then Sally also needs 2 extra weeks 6 months later, you want to make sure that you are consistent in your processes and in your policies. So you want to have this documented on how you handle extended medical leave. Most employers have this as a policy. Your 12 weeks are up for FMLA, and now we offer extended medical leave for up to an additional 3 months or whatever it is. So this is a very common policy that a lot of employers have in place. Military leave. I just wanted to briefly mention this. There are a lot of nuances to military leave, more than just these simple two bullets that I have up here on the screen. But I would be remiss if I didn't mention that military leave does fall under FMLA. So just two things to just keep in mind when it comes to FMLA. An eligible employee is entitled to take up to 26 work weeks of leave during a single 12-month period to care for a seriously injured or ill during their service covered service member. So what does that mean in a nutshell? Typically it's 12 weeks. We've just talked for 40 minutes about how it's 12 weeks. So the main difference with military leave and taking care of our loved one that is an injured service member is that it's 26 weeks. So I just wanted to point that out. The other part of FMLA in relation to military leave is that you have your spouse, for example, and this is a common example, and they're called to maybe active duty. You can take FMLA to get things in order. You know, perhaps you both worked full time out of the home, or your service member worked from home. So now you need to arrange childcare, and that's going to kind of take you a few weeks to get those things organized. That does fall under FMLA as well. So those are just two brief components under the military leave FMLA. I welcome you if you do have military leave families, employees at your place of work to read through the military leave regulations if this ever comes up at your place of work. But these are the two main highlights I wanted to point out today. Okay, Nicole, so we're at our poll questions, and this is just, I guess, our end quiz just to see who's still awake out there after talking about FMLA. So the first question, and I don't know if we're doing a poll or if people just kind of want to put in the chat whatever we want to do. Unfortunately, I can't see the chat, so I'm just going to take Nicole's word for it. But the first one is an employee has requested time off one time to take their daughter for their annual checkup. So is this possible FMLA or not? What do we think?
Joanna, I just launched the poll.
Okay.
So we've got some folks answering. I'll give it just a few more seconds. Alrighty. Can you see those responses?
I can't, so you have to tell me.
That's okay. There were, of the 33 responses, 100% of them said no.
Okay, good. Hey, I didn't put everybody to sleep. Good. Okay. Good. Right. So exactly. So that would not be considered FMLA. How about an employee discloses their spouse has an illness that requires surgery and then 2 weeks of in-home 24/7 recovery care?
Alrighty. 97% said yes, 3% said no.
Okay. Yes, this one would probably be FMLA. We would want to know what that illness is, but usually anything that requires a surgery will lead you to FMLA for sure. So that one would probably be, again, we're seeing a sentence, so we'd have to have a little bit more information. Okay, the next one, an employee states she's having outpatient surgery and will need 1 week off to recover and then 8 weeks of physical therapy. So she will need to leave for those appointments.
Alrighty. This one, 94% said yes, 6% said no.
Okay. This typically would be FMLA. It would start off as 1 week of FMLA. And I don't think I mentioned early on, FMLA is usually anything after 3 days. So anything after 3 days. Of course, we kind of use a little bit of common sense with that. the flu can put you down for a while, and that might not necessarily be FMLA, but FMLA is typically anything over 3 days. So this one would probably be FMLA, only knowing what we see up here. All right. And how about this last one? An employee suffers from chronic migraines and they will need time off from time to time when one occurs.
Little bit of a mix here.
Mm.
Alrighty, we've got 81% said yes, 19% said no.
Okay. This one too would be FMLA. And the reason why, and I'm not surprised that we had some people say no, because migraines is something that a lot of times we don't think of being a serious health condition, but it has been established through ADA and through the Department of Labor that it does qualify as a serious health condition. Now, that being said, you would want to ask your employee for a medical certification from their doctor saying that they have chronic migraines and that they're being seen for chronic migraines. This doesn't mean that you can just accept their word for it. You can ask for documentation for migraines. I don't have one up here that has to do with mental health, but mental health is the same thing. So if something were to, if somebody had, say, depression, for example, they had diagnosed depression, it would be similar to that as well. This can be difficult for employers to maintain operations, especially in healthcare. For those folks who work in healthcare and someone calls off at the last minute, this can be very difficult. So good. So I'm glad we had this discussion. I guess the moral of the story for these 4 questions, maybe not the first one, but for the 3 is that we want to see that medical certification. We want to see what's on there and clarify. And a lot of times it can start as FMLA and then move into intermittent FMLA, but that clock still ticks. All that time still kind of adds up together. All right. So that is all I have for today. I tried to make it 45 minutes. It looks like I'm right on time. Are there any other questions that popped up into the chat?
Yeah, we definitely had several come through.
Okay. And if I don't know the answer, I will find out and Nicole can put that in the email.
Yeah, of course. I can just read them off to you if that works for
Yeah.
you. The first one that came through is an employee required to recertify for intermittent leave each year if the condition is chronic.
Okay. And they might have sent that question before I got to that one slide. So I'll just, and I'm not saying I'm allowed to ask it again. I just wanted to make sure that I was clear on that. And I hope that I was, that a good rule of thumb is 6 months for that, that's a good rule of thumb. And they probably have an employee that said indefinitely, and physicians will do that a lot, and you can have them do 6 months.
All righty. Yeah, the question definitely did come through because I saw it in your slide and I was thinking, just give it 2 more minutes. She's going to get to it.
No, that's okay. But it's a really good question. It's a really good question.
Yeah. The second one that came through with intermittent leave, if the employee takes almost every Friday off, is there anything we can do as the employer for this?
It is interesting when the flare up comes on Fridays, right, guys? This is a sticky widget, because if it's, and that's with my migraine example, or my migraine's only on Mondays after the Steelers lose. So, because I'm sorry, guys, I'm a Steelers fan. I probably just lost everybody on the call. So you can, and I'm going to tread lightly because every situation is different. You just want to make sure that if it is Friday that it flares up, that you're getting the certifications. You can ask for doctor's excuses, especially if they say they're going to go to the doctor. You want to tread lightly with it. I wouldn't recommend just calling somebody out I wouldn't just say like, we think you're lying, so you would want to tread lightly, have that conversation, make sure it's a neutral party. So as an HR professional, I've had those conversations over my career where you talk to the employee, you say to the employee, I know that you have migraines, but I notice they only come on Fridays. Can we talk about that? Non-accusatory, to make sure that you're having that conversation and kind of see where that goes. Again, you can ask for doctors' excuses. That's different than asking for a recertification. So you can. But I know that is the hardest thing with intermittent leave. Sorry, I couldn't give an exact concrete answer. I would want to hear the full story offline. So.
No, I thought that was great. This third question, if someone comes back and accommodations can be made, I have an additional form related to the ADA. Is there an issue with this?
No, that's okay. No, that's totally fine. So if an employee comes back and they say they need to sit instead of stand or whatever it is, and you have some sort of form that just outlines what those accommodations are, that's totally fine. Again, as long as you're not asking about diagnosis and treatment, you're talking about the job functions from the job description and what those accommodations might be. That's fine. As long as the form, like I said, isn't asking anything that would violate HIPAA.
Next one, do you have examples of FMLA letters that can be sent to the employees containing return to work language and or recertification language?
Yes, I do have examples of those. I do. And I can put like a simple example in the email, Nicole, that you can send out.
Okay, that'd be great. All right, this last one that came through, it says best practices in handling paperwork being untimely received. Does FMLA go back to the original event date or at the designation notice date?
Excellent question. It goes back to the event date. So of course, we have to use a little bit of reasonableness when it comes to this. Like if you find out something started 6 months ago, are we going to go back to that date? So you would want to, someone comes to you and says, hey, 2 weeks ago, I started getting this, and now I'm going to start getting treated for it. That's why I called off 4 times over the last 2 weeks. You can definitely go back to that date for sure and start the FMLA from that process. Keeping in mind, when you do things like that, that is going to kind of mess up that timeline that we talked about. So, for example, an employee calls off a few times over a month period, and then they finally come to you and say, look, I got this, I'm going to need time off from every once in a while or whatever. And then you go back and date it, which is totally fine. You don't want to then say, well, you've already missed your 15-day window to return this paperwork, so you better have it here by tomorrow. And I don't think that's what you intended with that question, but that's a very common example, is backdating, and then how does that impact the time? You would still want to kind of honor that 15-day thing, because again, they're dealing with their healthcare provider on their end. But yes, you can definitely go back and backdate it.
That concludes the questions that came through. I'm not sure if
Okay.
anyone else wants to put anything else in the chat.
Well, I have my contact information up on the screen. So if anybody is interested in any assistance that I can provide, any questions that you have, my email is up there, my website's up there, and my cell phone number. Feel free to reach out to me.
Awesome. Well, as we wrap up, I just want to say, obviously, a huge thank you to Joanna. This information is so important and so insightful, and I can just about promise you that everyone here has so greatly appreciated your energy and your expertise on the information. So it truly has been such a pleasure to have you as our guest.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here.
Yeah, and as always, to anyone in our audience, if you do come up with any questions, whether you're watching this live or on our YouTube page later, just feel free to reach out with any questions that you may have. And with that being said, again, we appreciate all of you that have joined us today, and we'll see you in June.